When Socrates was asked by his friends how he'd like to be buried after death, he joked that they'd have to catch him first. The real him, his soul, would be off on his way to heavenly happiness. But why would Socrates think such a thing? Welcome to Untangle Philosophy. Today we're exploring Plato's argument from opposites for the immortality of the soul and his interesting views on reincarnation, including why, in Plato's eyes, a life of unrighteousness carries the risk of being reborn as a woman. For the ancient Greek philosophers, the soul, or psyche in Greek, is essentially a life-giving force. For Plato, the soul animates the body, but it's also indestructible and imperishable. Thus, there is a clear dualism, a distinction between body and soul. The body will die and decay, the soul is eternal. From Socrates' comments to his friends, we can infer that Plato, who wrote the dialogue, associates a person's true identity with their soul and not with their body. But Plato doesn't stop there. He also has Socrates enunciate several arguments to support this dualistic conception of the soul, including the argument from opposites. Socrates begins with an observation. Many things in life have opposites, and these opposites come into being because of each other. If everything were the same size and nothing ever grew, small and large wouldn't exist. The existence of small things creates the idea of large things and vice versa. Similarly, you can't have beautiful without ugly, faster without slower, stronger without weaker. Opposites like these also involve a process of coming to be. For example, a puddle becomes larger when it rains and smaller when it dries up. It can't have become larger if it was not before small. It can't get smaller if it were not larger. Now, Socrates says, sleeping and waking are opposites. They also involve a process of coming to be. If you go to sleep, you must have been awake, and if you wake up, you must have been asleep. So it is with life and death. From the fact that being dead means that you must have been alive, it must follow that being alive comes from being dead. As with the sleep-wake cycle, there is a constant cycle of dying and being reborn. As Socrates puts it, living people are born from the dead, no less than dead people from the living. He supplements this with the strange argument that if life and death were not circular but linear, everything would eventually be dead. Imagine if people kept going to sleep and never woke up. Eventually, there would only be sleep and no one left awake. Similarly, if living things kept dying but nothing ever came back to life, then all living things would eventually perish and the world would be entirely lifeless. If all things that partake in life were to die, but when they died, the dead remained in that form and didn't come back to life, wouldn't it be quite inevitable that everything would ultimately be dead and nothing would live? This is a wonderful argument, but you can't help but feel that there's something off about it. For me, the idea that opposites always act in reverse seems questionable. A puddle may get smaller and larger, but a tree increases in size by growing. But once it's grown, it doesn't shrink back to a sapling. You might say that the death of the tree is a form of shrinkage, but that sounds like cheating. Technically, the tree gets smaller when branches blow off in a storm or its leaves fall in autumn. But what about an evergreen tree in a sheltered spot? Why is life and death like sleeping and waking, and not like an evergreen tree in a sheltered spot? The fascinating implication of Plato's argument is that the soul undergoes a process of reincarnation. The soul is born into a body, that body dies, and the soul is reborn into a new body. We often associate reincarnation with Eastern philosophies. However, it also has a history in Western thought. An earlier philosopher, Pythagoras, who did more than discover the theorem that is attributed to him, taught a doctrine of reincarnation. The belief that the soul could be born into animals motivated his followers to pursue a life of vegetarianism. For Plato, the soul doesn't wear the body like a set of clothes that you can discard when they wear out. Instead, the body is akin to a prison for the soul, like the prisoners in Plato's cave. The soul is tempted by the pleasures of the body, like food, drink, and sex. This distracts the soul from its true purpose, contemplation of the forms. The forms are perfect, ideal essences of which everything that we experience is a mere imitation. For example, according to Plato, we can recognize beautiful things because they partake in the form of beauty. True reality and knowledge lie in these eternal forms. The soul is happy when it's fulfilling its proper function of philosophizing about the forms. Bodily pleasures are just an unhelpful hindrance. Plato also suggests that the soul's conduct during life determines the form it will take in the next life. Those who have cultivated gluttony, for example, and lechery and drunkenness, and have taken no pains to avoid them, are likely to enter the forms of donkeys and animals of that sort. Don't you think so? Meanwhile, a life of cowardice and unrighteousness runs the risk of returning as a woman. And while this might appear sexist by our standards, Plato is actually ahead of the curve on issues of gender, arguing in the Republic that women as well as men can make ideal rulers, something which his contemporaries were flabbergasted by. What about Socrates' argument from opposites? Are you flabbergasted by that? Or do you think there's a way in which the argument succeeds? It's important to note that Socrates doesn't present this argument in isolation, and he doesn't expect it to convince entirely on its own. He attempts to complete the job by supplying the arguments from recollection and affinity. But for those, we'll have to wait until next time. Thank you for watching.